on Egypt as well as the United States' role there. And to do that, I'm joined by Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff, member of the Intelligence Committee and Appropriations Committee. Representative Schiff, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Alex.
So I know you took a somewhat interesting stance on Egypt on the aid that we offer during the Appropriations Committee hearing last month. And you say this is a coup, which would be enough to stop giving aid, but you want to keep sending them this money. Does the violence this week and, frankly, the shocking death toll, does it at all change your position on that?
It does. It does. You know, as I mentioned in the Appropriations Committee when I offered an amendment, U.S. law requires a cutoff of aid when there's a military coup, and plainly there's been a military coup. So my point was that we either ought to change the law to allow the relationship, the military support to continue, or we ought to enforce the law, but we can't just ignore the law. At this point, though, I think that we just ought to let the law go into effect, and we ought to cut off aid and make it very clear. I have to say, Alex, it's not likely to affect the situation on the ground at this point. In fact, the military resources we're providing are going to be more than compensated by what the Saudis and the Emirates are doing. They're providing more money than we ever were providing. But at the same time, I think it does bolster our own credibility in the future that when we say we're going to cut off aid, that we will cut off aid. When we say if there's an excess of violence, as there has been, and it will result in this termination of our relationship, at least financial relationship, that we mean what we say. Yeah,
and I think we're donating about $1.5 billion in both military aid support as well as humanitarian aid, but you're right, we compare to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they're donating about $4 billion, so there's the comparison there. But I do want to read to you, sir, a quote from the Washington Post editorial board in which they write, because of the decision to not label it a coup and support the military, the Obama administration is complicit in the new and horrifyingly bloody crackdown launched Wednesday by the de facto regime against tens of thousands of protesters. And as you well know, sir, the president came out during his vacation on Martha's Vineyard on Thursday and addressed the issue. So what is your response to the Washington Post?
Well, I think it was a coup. I think it should have been called a coup. And in fact, in the language of our statute, you don't have to call it a coup so long as the military plays a decisive role in overthrowing a democratically elected government, and plainly that was the case. So I think it should have been called what it was. At the same time, I can understand the administration wanting to try to maintain a relationship with the military. There were reasons to do that, but we need to stand by the letter of our own law when we're trying to promulgate the rule of law in other countries, and I think we took a hit to our credibility when we weren't willing to essentially call something what it clearly was. And as much as it may not impact the situation today, in the future, I think we need to send a message to not only the Egyptian military but others around the world that when we say we're going to cut off assistance if you overturn a democratically elected government, that we really mean it.
Okay. Let's talk a bit more about some other news that came out via the Washington Post. Speaking of the Washington Post on Friday, that the NSA has broken privacy rules thousands of times a year, illegally gathering data on Americans. Now, to be fair, many of these cases were mistakes, simple human errors. They're trying to plug in information, and you may get one digit off or a misspelling of a name by a letter or two. But some reports accuse the agency of often and intentionally misleading Congress and the FISA court. What's your reaction to this?
Well, there have been a lot of mistakes, and of course, none of these mistakes are acceptable, although we do have to understand that these are very sophisticated systems, software and computer systems that allow us to do these kind of searches, and those systems are necessary. But you make a small mistake, you get a digit off, and you collect a lot of records you're not supposed to collect. We have to have a zero-tolerance policy for any intentional errors, and I think the audit didn't indicate that there were any intentional errors. But in terms of whether the agencies are misleading Congress, I can't say I've seen evidence of people willfully coming in before Congress and with an intent to deceive us. There have been cases, probably where they haven't provided the full information that they ought to provide, and it's very difficult for us. We're mismatched in terms of our resources. If the agencies don't tell us about problems that they have, it's very hard for us to find out about them. One of the things I'll be very interested to see is these internal audits which aren't provided to Congress. are provided in a different form. We get reports of these violations and these mistakes. And I'd like to compare the two to make sure that we are in fact getting the full picture from the NSA and other agencies.
Okay. May I also ask you about those terror threats that shut down 19 embassies for a week beginning 2 weeks ago tomorrow? The Associated Press is reporting that those threats were part of a conversation in a jihadist chat room in which the head of al-Qaeda in Yemen asked for permission to carry out attacks. Does that version of the story match the information you've received?
Well, I really don't think I can go into the specifics too much, but I can say that we had credible and multi-sourcing on this terrorist threat. So it wasn't just one source of information. It was fairly high level, and there was a lot of confidence by the intelligence community in the intelligence that led to such a wide shutdown. I think, as we can see from events, that the effect of going public with this was that they deferred their plans, I hope indefinitely, but certainly deferred them, and that served a valuable purpose. It gave us more time to analyze the threat. It gave us more time to go after some of the people involved. So I think it was the right decision, but we're not out of the woods in Yemen by any means, and we have to maintain a very high state of alert.
Okay. California Representative Adam Schiff, good to see you. Many thanks.